Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristyn Wong-Tam, and I'm the Member of Provincial Parliament for Toronto Centre. I'm also the official critic for the Ministry of the Attorney General. I'm joined today with a number of colleagues as well as community advocates to speak about the concerns that we have regarding Ontario Place. Joining me from the House is our members of my caucus, including Chris Glover, Spadina Fort York, as well as Butila Carpoche, Parkdale High Park. We also have Cindy Wilkie from the Ontario Place for All Coalition, Bill Greaves from the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, as well as Richard Longley, also from ACO, former president. As many of you are aware, Ontario Place opened in 1971. It happened and took place on 155 acres of public Toronto waterfront land. This is owned and paid for, built entirely by the provincial government, which means it's public tax dollars put to work on our behalf. In 2019, there was an RFP that was issued by the Ford government. There was no consultation around the RFP and very little detail that was exposed to the public. What we've now learned is that they have selected a company from Australia called Therme. From Therme Group. And this is a for-profit company that has now committed to building a new water park spa theme facility. It is a very large facility. The footprint of the site, if the lands in question, is about 3.7 acres. This will effectively close off publicly owned land that is accessible today. Waterfront is, of course, a public common. It belongs to all of us, not just those of us in Ontario, but those of us in Toronto. Offering to give back 12 acres of publicly owned land that is already accessible, as the provincial government is proposing, is not really a great deal, especially when we're taking into consideration that it is 155 acres of publicly accessible land today. There is going to be a consultation that's going to be carried out by the City of Toronto by way of the zoning application that's been submitted by the province of Ontario. What I find extremely alarming is that there isn't any public consultation that was held by the provincial government leading up to these decisions. So much of this land deal is cloaked in secrecy. What we do know, which has been disclosed in the media, that there's $200 million that's been committed of public Ontario taxpayer dollars to preparing the site, and potentially up to $450 million more to build an underground parking facility that is 5 levels deep and about 2,118 parking spots. There is also going to be the removal and clear cutting of 850 plus trees, and that's before we factor in the actual impact of the Therme construction on the West Island. Overall, today, Ontario Place is a site that we should be celebrating. It's a site that has a long and rich history. What do we care about at the Ontario ONDP? We care about making sure that the land is publicly accessible, not just today, but in perpetuity. We care about public accountability for hard-paid tax dollars. We want to make sure that there's good value for money. And everything that we've seen from the Ford government so far is not giving us any confidence that that is coming forward. The leader of the official opposition, Marit Stiles, has submitted a letter to the Attorney General of Ontario. This letter is asking her to support a request that's come in from the community organizations that you see behind me. They are asking for a compliance audit and a value for money audit, something that we strongly agree must take place before anything else proceeds with this secret land deal. Their letter points to the fact that there are several concerns laid out. And our leader, Marit Stiles, reinforces this, that the government's plan has exempted itself from the environmental protections. The protections laid out in the Environment Protection Act of 1990, as well as the Environmental Assessment Act of 1990. The government has also seemed to have exempted itself from preparing a strategic conservation plan as required from the Ontario Heritage Act, again, 1990. All of this is very concerning. What we want to be able to put forward today and make sure that everyone is aware that before we go any further and before the Ford government proceeds, they have to answer some very basic fundamental questions, such as, what do the people of Ontario get in this secret Doug Ford deal with a mysterious foreign company? What are the long-term leases around the land? What are the terms and conditions? What is he binding Ontarians to, not just today, but because it's a 99-year lease, potentially generations into the future? Trillium Park itself, a piece of Ontario Place, was reconstructed and revitalized for a mere $30 million. Can you imagine what the total corporate subsidies of $650 million, if canceled, will do for Ontario coffers? How can we prioritize the revitalization of Toronto's waterfront, but as well as the other financial needs in communities across the province? Is it money well spent? Why are these corporate subsidies being given to a foreign company? And why do we have no financial disclosure or even a business case to review? I'd like to welcome to the podium now Chris Glover, MPP for Spadina-Fort York. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kristyn. I want to thank Kristyn Wong-Tam and also Batila Carpoche, my colleagues in the Ontario NDP, for being here today. And I also want to thank Cindy Wilkie, the co-chair of Ontario Place for All, and Bill Greaves and Richard Longley from the Architectural Conservancy. I am deeply concerned about the process that's been followed with the redevelopment of Ontario Place. It's been shrouded in secrecy, and they're playing fast and loose with the rules. They're exempting themselves from the required environmental assessment. They are exempting themselves from their heritage commitments, and they are committing Ontarians to an estimated $650 million in investment only to hand over this property to a private for-profit corporation. Kristyn mentioned that Ontario Place was opened in 1971. The original vision for Ontario Place was to celebrate Ontario. Every piece of steel, John Robart said that every piece of steel would be mined and smelted in Ontario. Eb Zeidler, the architect, Michael Huff, the landscape architect, Eric McMillan designed the Children's Village, invented the ball pit. The IMAX Theatre was the first permanent home of IMAX, which was an Ontario-developed technology. It launched international careers for all of these Ontario-based businesses. We need to make Ontario Place a place to celebrate Ontario, and I have asked the Financial Accountability Office for a cost-benefit analysis of that $650 million. I'd like to call Cindy Wilkie to the podium.
Good morning. So I am the co-chair of Ontario Place for All. We are a grassroots organization with over 9,000 supporters. When the Premier announced his intention to redevelop Ontario Place, we had hoped for a plan to engage the public in a conversation about the future of a cherished Ontario icon. We were disappointed. The public and even the City of Toronto were completely excluded from the decision-making. And now that we see the proposed development plans, we see that they raise very serious concerns about how this government is managing valuable provincial resources. Faced with a shocking level of public subsidy, a complete lack of transparency as to the value proposition for taxpayers, and the apparent disregard for heritage and environmental conservation of Ontario Place, we joined two community-based organizations in submitting a request to the Auditor General of Ontario, asking for a value-for-money audit of the Therme deal, a compliance investigation into the mishandling of conservation of Ontario Place as a valuable cultural heritage asset, and a compliance investigation into the exemption of the Therme Spa project from the EA currently being carried out on the rest of Ontario Place. Today, we are very gratified to have the official opposition joining us in making these requests. When an iconic and historic public resource like Ontario Place is transferred to a private business, we believe the public is entitled to know what is in it for Ontarians. What are the real costs to current and future Ontarians? How do the benefits add up? Even basic details like the length of the lease to Therme have never been made public. More importantly, where is the accountability to the public for a decision to privatize 14 acres of public parkland when adjacent neighborhoods are park deficient? Where is the accountability to the public for over $500 million of public subsidy to support the establishment of a commercial spa operation at Ontario Place? Where is the accountability to the public for the use of a pretext to avoid the environmental assessment on the Therme site that would scrutinize the requirement to clear-cut over 800 trees and destroy an established heritage landscape and natural habitat? We also asked some more fundamental questions. How was this Therme lease decision made? The procurement was actually not a formal or normal RFP process. Who made the decision? What were the selection criteria? What were the other proposals that were considered and rejected? Is there a report from a fairness monitor? How do we know that the decision was made in the best interests of the province? When the Premier appointed the late Jim Genoux as chair and sole director of Ontario Place in 2019, Mr. Genoux was quoted as saying he saw his job as remaking Ontario Place into whatever Doug Ford wanted. How do we know that is not how the decision to deal with this important public asset was made? Possibly the biggest question is why spend $500 million to bring an Austrian spa to Ontario Place, a business that says nothing about Ontario except by implication that Ontario has nothing local to offer? Why would we do that when something like $60 to $80 million would restore the West Island landscape to the quality of the award-winning Trillium Park? These are the questions that we hope the Auditor General and the public will consider. Thank you.
My name is Bill Greaves, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. ACO is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that aims to encourage the conservation and reuse of structures, districts, and landscapes of architectural, historic, and cultural significance. Ontario Place has been widely recognized as an internationally significant example of 20th century architecture and landscape design. In 2020, the World Monuments Fund included Ontario Place, along with only 25 other sites around the world, in its WATCH program that identifies sites of great heritage value that are at risk. It's also received the highest possible level of designation by the provincial government under the Ontario Heritage Act. That designation specifies that Ontario Place is, quote, one of the most important expressions of late 20th century modernism in the history of the province. And that designation comes with rules. In addition to its value as exceptional architecture and landscape design, it's also a cherished public space that celebrates Ontario as it was explicitly designed to be. This public character is integral to its cultural heritage value. Unfortunately, the provincial government's actions over the past 3 years have made it clear that they view Ontario Place as a piece of waterfront property to be commercially developed, not as a heritage treasure to be protected. But the Ontario Heritage Act is clear that when it comes to sites like Ontario Place, the provincial government must act as a steward, not a developer. Specifically, it states, Ontario's cultural heritage resources belong to the present and future generations of Ontarians. Managing provincial heritage properties wisely is in the best interests of Ontarians. So, how should the government wisely manage this site, and what have they actually done to date? Under the OHA, what they should have done first was to produce a strategic conservation plan, a legally required foundational document that is to guide all decisions about any changes and the conservation of a heritage site. Instead, a call for development was issued in 2019, and its terms specifically stated that anything on the site could be demolished except for the already leased Budweiser stage. After a public outcry, they backed off and agreed to protections for the Cinesphere, Pods, and Trillium Park. But crucially, this ignores the fact that Ontario Place is a unified composition of architecture and landscape. You can't just carve it up and have it retain its value. A view of the Cinesphere, framed by a 50-year-old weeping willow, is not the same thing as glimpsing it through a giant glass wall with a few palm trees in front of it. This is just the kind of misguided approach that would have been prevented with a strategic conservation plan done in a timely way. But they didn't even start working on one or doing any of the associated consultations until the development partners had already been picked. And that's really important because this tainted the whole process from the start by insisting that everyone accept the privatization of the site for Therme, Live Nation, and all as a fait accompli, something ACO does not accept. So what has this resulted in? Well, among other things, clear-cutting a forest to build a convention center-sized spa right next to the Cinesphere and the pods, dwarfing them. What would we think if other governments around the world treated their iconic modern sites like this? What if in Australia, Sydney decided to put an enormous spa in the park next to their opera house? Closer to home, what if Toronto built a condo tower on top of the skating rink at Nathan Phillips Square? It seems clear to us at ACO that the original vision of Ontario Place is still very much needed. A green place to enjoy city views from the breakwater, swim at the Pebble Beach, wander in the trees on the West Island, see a film at the Cinesphere, go to a restaurant in one of the villages at the water's edge, or in the spectacular pods suspended above it. So, we urge the province to reconsider the path it's on. Recognize Ontario Place as one of Canada's most important cultural treasures and treat the entire site with the care and respect it deserves.
So I want to thank all of our speakers. Do we have any questions from any reporters? Okay, seeing none, we'll conclude this press conference. Again, I want to thank everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Yes.